Alright, welcome back. So I want you to take note of the time, 11:36 a.m. on August 2nd. The previous parts of the video, they were sort of, I'm going to end up editing it down so that it skips through or fast forwards through some of the more boring parts where I'm just typing and stuff like that. But the total time spent on this yesterday was about 3 hours, and that got us to about step 4. The only reason that it stopped, probably you could hear the cell phone chimes and stuff like that. I forgot to turn the cell phone ringer off. That was my wonderful partner letting me know that he was off work and wanted to get a beer and stuff like that. So the real life intruded, but our runtime so far in this project is 3 hours. And keep in mind that that's my working through this while stopping to explain things, while stopping to sort of talk about my choices and how this whole system works and that sort of thing. So if I had sat down and not had to do any of that and had just worked straight through, I could have gotten to step 4 in probably close to like an hour and a half. So this is a really, really rapid development process. So I had to kind of get caught up with where we left off yesterday to make sure that I'm on track. I should let everybody know that so I made a concentrated effort yesterday after I left this project not to think about it, not to develop it anymore in my head and try and let all this go. I've got 6 other projects going on, so whenever it came to a quiet moment last night or when I was laying in bed, that sort of thing, what I did is I just focused my concentration on some of those other projects. I've always got a lot of stuff going on. I've got a couple of books coming up. I've got a couple of books to write for other people coming up. I'm developing outlines to sell, that sort of thing. So, having gotten caught up with where the last thing we were talking about was that there were these empty scenes. We were counting them. I counted them and then recounted them. There are 11 empty scenes. That's the actual number. And so that's really important because so we're going to go ahead and move on to, whoops, I did this again. We're going to go ahead and move on to step 5. Well, we've done step 5. So step 5 is we got about halfway through this process almost yesterday. Step 5 was to scatter all these things across the outline. Step 6, write single sentence descriptions for each scene, focused on what is revealed in that scene and what choice is made. In other words, here's some examples. This is the format. This is a really good format. Billy learns that Emily is really Edward in disguise and chooses to run away with him or her. Susan learns that she is being transferred out of the office and sleeps with her coworker Jim. So the reason to do it this way, the reason to write these single sentence descriptions that basically focus on a revelation and then a choice is because this ensures that every scene is guaranteed to drive the story forward in some way. Not everybody outlines this way, and not everybody has to. This specific system, all of it, it's not necessarily going to work for every single person out there. There's no one way to write a book. There's no one way to outline a book. I hope that a lot of people can use this system and that it really helps them. And I'll talk a little bit later, or I may edit into the first part of this video, a little bit of a discussion of why I developed this system in the first place. And it's more really than just developing my own process. But so when we focus on just the actions and choices, we know that something is happening in every scene. If you let yourself get sidetracked when you talk about a scene and you go into a lot of detail about what you want to talk about in this scene in terms of character, so maybe you write a whole discussion for, say, chapter 1, where you talk all in the scene notes all about Cable's backstory and the things that he's thinking about and stuff like that. You can end up with like a page-long summary for that scene that doesn't really accomplish anything, that it's basically just character and background stuff. So there's a place for that, and the place for that is in the notes and in the margins and in these other files that we've got going on, the character backgrounds and that sort of thing. That's the place to put all those details. If you let yourself get carried away with details in the scenes, then what happens is that you have some scenes that are just not going to go anywhere. They're not going to push anything forward. You're going to have to do a lot of cutting and editing later on. Now, don't let that make it sound like you can use the system to avoid having to cut anything and to avoid having to edit anything, because there's no such animal as that. you're almost always going to have to edit things down. This whole process and this direction, strategy for planning scenes is not about avoiding the first draft, and it's not about avoiding edits. The purpose of this strategy is just to make sure that every scene, inherently serves a purpose. You can't escape the first draft, and you shouldn't try to escape the first draft, right? So I'm going to work on that, and I'll fast forward through a lot of this, and when I pick up again, we'll talk about how I decided to make those choices and where we filled things in. Now, I want to take note that one of the things that's not going to happen right now is we're not going to fill in all of these empty scenes, because what we're going to end up doing, we want to flesh out the scenes we already have, and then we're going to dig for subplots, and we're going to use that to fill in some of the empty scenes. We'll also be able to find out where we have particular choices and actions and revelations, and where we want to foreshadow or allude to those things. So it's a super clean, super organic process that's going to be very effective at getting all of this stuff done in a very balanced kind of way. So here I go with that, and I'll catch up with you guys in just a minute. Alright, so there's still some empty scenes, but I filled in one or two of them just because I found opportunities to go back and reference that, so reference some of the stuff happening in the later part of the book. Let's go ahead and focus on just this screen. I'm going to expand the cards a little bit so that we get the entire, there we go. So if you're trying to follow along really closely with each individual scene, just pause the video as I scroll down. There's a little bit of extra detail in some of these summary scenes. It's the scene summaries. Not all of them are just precisely revelation choice. That's not, a terrible thing. I did try and keep the details as minimal as possible. Mostly, I just want to sort of set the tone for a particular scene whenever I do these things. But they all follow a similar structure. Like that first one, Cable learns he's being released early on good behavior, and after meeting his parole officer, chooses to jump right back in with his old crowd because he doesn't know what else to do with his life. So we're going to show again that first plot point, that first character point for him, that his life sort of lacks direction. So we know that whenever we go and plot that scene out, and especially when we get into writing it, and this is the scene that I'll be writing at the end of this video, right in front of you, and I'll explain how I adapt, like when I lay out the scene points, how I adapt those points into the text. But I did that, and we ended up with almost the entire story full. So we've still got to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 scenes to fill up with what will ultimately be backstory, subplot, world building, things like that. So I'm just going to scroll down through these so that as I go, you have a chance to, if you want to follow along, you can pause and look at each of these scenes to see what I mean by how these things progress. So these are the first 6 scenes. These are the next 6 scenes. The next 6. You can see this part. This is where there's a big gap. So there's going to be a lot that we have to fill in here, but that's fine because we already sort of know what needs to happen between these things. Also note that in scene 13, remember when I mentioned before that later on in one of the scenes in the 20s that Cable gets invited to go on this score. So this is going to be the scene where we first get a couple of details about that. Now, this is not where they're planning it. This is not going to be where they invite him to take part in it. They're just going to be, it's just going to be something like there's news on the street or something along those lines. But it's not going to go anywhere now. That's foreshadowing. It's going to be subtle, right? It's also going to show us that Cable is being a little bit sensitive, and his friends are sort of prodding him and that sort of thing. So we're going to set up some more of that contrast between one world and the other in Cable's old world where he's, selfish and works for himself and all that other stuff. In that world, it's not okay to be super emotional. You're sort of a pussy for, having emotions and being mopey and being in love and things like that. Cable, of course, he's not going to know at this point that he's in love with Austin. That's going to happen later. In the midpoint, we talk about, again, they have this emotional connection. It's going to be from Austin's point of view, and we're going to know because we're going to have that stuff going on inside Austin's head that Austin actually does have feelings for Cable, very real feelings, but he's not going to say anything just now because even though he realizes that he wants to change, even though Caleb, is talking about how he wants to change, and they're both really, happy that they've made this sort of jump in the relationship, they're not ready to admit anything just now because there's still a lot at stake. At this point, Austin is still going to be in the law program or whatever program we put him in for convenience. And he still is stuck on this idea that he has expectations to live up to. So in light of those stakes, and again, I said it at the beginning, keep in mind throughout the whole thing what's at stake here, right? So those stakes are going to show up in the midpoint. It's going to show us that for these two people, they still have those things on their mind. It's still getting in between them. So the next 6 scenes, we've already talked about the pinch point. We've talked about this point where Cable is going to run off and leave Austin to get arrested. Here we're going to pull back the stakes again. This time, his parents kind of have a bargaining chip, but what I've decided here is that this is going to be one of the first time that Austin intentionally manipulates his parents, right? So we want to show that. Well, I'm not going to judge Austin for manipulating his parents because, they're kind of douchebags if the whole idea is that they're only going to help him if he does what they want him to do. Like, that's no way to raise a child. But nonetheless, we're going to show here that a little bit more of Cable has crept into Austin than he maybe admitted earlier on. And by crept in, I don't necessarily mean anal sex, even though there will certainly be that in this book. Scene 23 is the fallout, third plot point. Now, note that there's a lot happening here in this scene, really. It's a short summary, but there's potentially 3 sort of locale jumps, right? Cable's with his gang, and he refuses. They have a fight. Of course, he's a bad boy and he's kind of a badass, so even though he'll take a few blows and he'll be a little bit bruised up when he sees Austin, like, he's going to come out on top of that. But then after he leaves, we have to think about the timing, right? It's going to happen maybe in the middle of the day, or maybe we'll jump forward in time, a day or so, a couple of days. So he's going to go and get a job, and it'll just be the sort of job that you can get off the street, right? So it's going to be construction. We already know that. And since it's going to be construction, that's going to show up later on in the story. Not a huge reveal, not because it's the third act, right? It's going to be a very minor thing. So we're going to hint at his interest in architecture beforehand and talk about how he, has this interest. He's just never really pursued it, and we learn that we learned that by plotting this later scene. So then we've got our third plot point. I haven't decided yet whether this is going to happen when Cable and Austin actually go to meet Austin's parents. We may not actually do that scene. This could all happen in Austin's dorm room or somewhere else. I don't know. We'll see. The thing is that I don't want it to seem like Austin cuts off his connection to his parents altogether, because you don't want to have a terribly unsympathetic character. So even though his parents are kind of douchebags, the better way to go in terms of delivering an overall happy ending is for him to come to some sort of a balanced agreement with his parents. So that may be where this scene goes. That's going to push the length of these two scenes pretty far. So again, when we talked about the length in the beginning and hitting the right, hitting the right percentage in terms of how far the story goes, those are things that will have to be kept in mind. So I may end up breaking scene 23. What I would do, and I'll just show you real quick how exactly this would happen, but I would go into the corkboard under scene 23 specifically, and I would just add 23.1, 23.2, 23.3, and then each of these scenes would be a subset of that plan. All the stuff that I need to set up before the end of the book, and I would break the distance down a little bit, or the total word counts of each scene down a little bit. So 2200 is supposed to be the average for each scene. Some of those scenes are going to run longer and shorter though. So what I'll do is take stock of, in earlier scenes, some of the ones that kind of where I was more economic and saved some words essentially, and then what I'll do is distribute some of those words here to try and hit as close to that 70,000 word target as possible. So I might do, say, 1,500 words for the gang scene and the violence there. Do maybe 1,000 words for the scene where he actually goes and gets the job, just a quick montage scene of him getting dressed and fixing his life a little bit, and so on and so forth. I may not actually show that he's hired here. He might just show up for the interview, right? Because you don't need to see an interview scene. That's sort of a boring scene. So it can be pretty short. And then 23.3 may actually be it may just be him showing up to Austin's house or his apartment, dressed in a suit, ready to sort of lay it all on the line. So that's sort of how I think about that part of it when you get to those longer scenes. And then, of course, let's see. So we got that far. The next 6 scenes, there's a little bit in here that, again, I'm going to need to call back, right? So we talked about the parole officer. I'm going to have to go back at some point and show the antagonism between Cable and his parole officer. That's fine, though, because remember, I've got those 9 empty scenes. That whole thing, that can be a subplot between the two of them. The black moment. This is also kind of new, so at some point we're going to go back and make sure that Austin actually meets some of Cable's gang associates, right? And probably what will happen is that since he gets taken in, Austin doesn't hear from him, and then he goes out looking for him, encounters one of these guys that got away. There's a little bit of action, a little bit of tension there. The climax is sort of technically spread over 2 scenes, and this is the part that, now that I'm here, this may require a little bit of refinement, right? The whole idea of Austin bailing Cable out of jail, that can speak to a little bit of sacrifice on Austin's part, what he's willing to do to go the distance for Cable and that sort of thing. And then we want to turn around and talk about how Cable goes the distance for Austin. So for the climax to span 2 scenes is not that big a deal. I may want to go back and sort of think about how I can turn this just a little bit more towards Cable ultimately being sort of the heroic character. So it may be that Austin, when he uses whatever money he's got to bail Cable out of jail, for him that may be a huge sacrifice. He may be looking down the barrel at next semester and having to pay for his classes soon and realizing that, like, it's a choice between bailing Cable out of jail or going to school, and he chooses ultimately to bail Cable out of jail, right? So that way, there's a big sacrifice, a big romantic gesture in the end, and then in scene 30, Cable turns that around, really puts his nose to the grindstone, shows what he's capable of. We will have already talked about his architecture interest before, and let's keep in mind that, like, if you work on a construction site and you take a look at the plans and you think to yourself, like, ooh, hey, I think we could save a little money if we design it a little bit like this. The architectural firm doesn't then turn around and pay you for making that observation. They just take that idea and they run with it, and you get shafted. But it's a romance. We want it to have a good happy ending, so we can bend the rules of general reality just a little bit and say that the people at this architectural firm are particularly magnanimous when it comes to that sort of thing, even though in real life they probably totally aren't. And in the denouement, it's going to be from Austin's point of view. We're going to skip a little time, just a little bit, a few weeks or a few months, or whatever. We're going to sort of look at our timeline when we get to the writing of the story. It's Cable's first day of school. He's turned his life around, but he's still a little bit. We're going to show that he's still a little bit of a rebel, like maybe just in the way that he dresses and the classes that he decided to take, or whatever. We'll just demonstrate that, like, look, he's still him. Austin is still Austin. But they've found this common ground where we'll show that they're moving in, that they've already moved in together. And the reason we jump ahead to that is because nobody wants to see the process of selecting an apartment and stuff like that. That's the boring part of the happily ever after. The exciting part is the part where they finally commit to everything and admit their feelings. So one of the things that I want to point out is that over the course of these scenes, Austin, he admits his feelings in the third plot point, but Cable doesn't. We will find a place later on, probably in this scene, where Cable finally has that last bit of opening up, and he admits that he loves Austin as well. Now, again, remember that last 25%, that third act of the book, we can't give the reader any new information, but we can talk about how Cable really feels back here in scene 25, in scene 27. We can tell the reader, like, that Cable is in fact in love with Austin. In fact, we can actually go back and we can say that in scene 23 before Austin even admits his feelings. But that way, when it comes up in the third act, it's not new to the reader. Never any new information in the third act. So let's actually go ahead and make a note of that here. Right? So Cable is going to realize that he's in love with Austin at about scene 23. Austin has already been through the midpoint where he realized there was a strong emotional connection. In the third plot point, he admits it. But in this scene, we're going to build up here about how Cable, probably he feels really worried about the fact that he is in love with Austin, because his type of character, this bad boy character, one of their hallmarks is that they keep themselves closed off. They don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to get hurt. That whole bad boy thing is ultimately a facade. And frankly, that's generally true of bad boys in real life. Like, they're just the type of people who tend, to put on this front. So that all sort of ends up working really, really well. So now that all of those scenes are in there, we have food for a lot of subplots. What do we have? We have the subplot between Austin and his parents. that their whole development, their conversation, the pressure they put on him, that's a subplot because it doesn't have to do directly with Austin and Cable. So that's one. With Cable, we've got the subplot with his gang. That's two. That doesn't, again, it's a subplot because it doesn't directly affect both Austin and Cable. Cable's interaction with his parole officer, that's a third subplot. Because it affects Cable, but not Austin. So that's two for Cable and one for Austin. If we're going to pick another subplot, which we kind of need to, the other subplot will be for Austin. So the reason that I'm looking at those and saying, like we need one more, has to do with how I plan subplots, how I look for them, right? So course of the story, single sentences, look for subplots. Okay, so there's some things that are not actually in here that should be, and by the time this template is up for download, they will be. But basically, for every, when you look at the base plot points, right? If you were to line those all up and just do those plot points, and let's say you plan it at about like 2,500 words, 2,500 words per per scene, right, for a major plot point. 2,500 times, including the denouement and the disturbance, there are ultimately 9 plot points. Some of them will be shorter, some of them will be longer. You end up with about 22,500 words. Add about another 7,500 words. For other scenes, the connective tissue scenes that you just have to get from one plot to the other, and you get about 30,000 words. And that's if you strip a story at 2,500 words per scene down to the bare minimum. Ours is going to be about 70,000 words, so we have 40,000 more words to fill up. Now, it's a bit of some tricky math. For every 10,000 words over 30,000, we want approximately one subplot. If you've got a subplot that's really involved and takes up a lot of time, then you don't need all 4 of those in this case, right? So it takes another 40,000 to get to 70,000 from 30. So we want 4 subplots, 4 basic small subplots. But for those 4 subplots, you don't want to take up more than about 30% of the book with them. 60 to 70% of the book needs to be that central storyline. In this case, it's the storyline having to do with them. So we're going to do that at the outside and say 70%. We know that 700 is our 1%. 700 is our 1%. We have 30% to work with. So that times 30, 2,100 words divided by our 2,200, and we get 9.5 scenes. That's perfect. We have places where those subplots are already referenced, but we have 9 scenes available. We're going to round down. Again, don't round up. So we're going to round down to 9 scenes, and we have 9 scenes in which to explore 4 subplots. That's perfect. That's exactly the number that we want. So that will be the next step, is to dig for subplots and to start laying out where exactly those subplots take place. And then the next step will be a process of kind of tying that all together. We're going to expand all the subplot plot points. We're going to rearrange some scenes to make sure that everything is in an order that makes sense narratively, that serves the story best. So there'll be a little bit of shuffling around potentially. We'll revise everything, and that I will skip through and just sort of follow up later with some commentary. And then we finally get to plotting the individual scenes. Revise again, and write the book. So we are most of the way done with this process. And it's 12:28 now. I'll have to check the timestamp, but our total time spent on this is somewhere in the range of about 5 hours. And we're already to the point where we're almost have all of our scenes plotted. And I just want to point out that a lot of people can plot, write out chapter descriptions a lot faster than this. The fact that I'm stopping to talk about things, that sort of thing, like I just spent the last probably sort of almost 10 minutes talking about the process of developing those chapter summaries and things like that. If you cut out all of that talking, then this happens a lot faster. I do this process in about 3 hours. So the thing to realize, though, is that even though you could just sit down and just churn out chapter summaries really fast to get through a story, that story is going to require you to go back and to intentionally reach into those details and start balancing things. Because we did it the way we did, we focused on the midpoint, we focused on our characters, we focused on our midpoint transformation and what that tells us about the other plot points. In step 3. In step 4, we worked with the character arc to make sure that that arc is there, and then we took those things and we made sure that they're throughout the story in a balanced way. What we're developing here is a really balanced story. It's a story that has adequate plot, adequate character arc. Things happen in a natural, logical, but also sort of emotionally tense way, and all of that is coming out of a point where, if you remember at the very beginning of this video, or in the first part, if I end up sort of breaking these things up into multiple videos, we didn't start out with a whole lot. All we need to begin with was, we need a bad boy story. 2 boys, because it's going to be an MM romance, or a male-male romance. So we started with almost nothing and got to this point with what's sort of shaping up to be a really interesting, really compelling story, right? With, all sorts of like action and emotional ups and downs and great parallelisms, and like it's a good literary work. So keep that in mind. I'm going to stop and take a quick break and make a couple of calls, because it's the time of day where I start having to do errands and things like that. Take note of the time, 12:30 p.m. When I pick this back up, we will get through the next several steps, and then by the end of this video, in real time, within about 2, maybe 3 hours, we're going to get to the point where we're actually filling out all of those scenes, and we're actually going to write the first scene of this book. Filling out all of those scenes, and we're actually going to write the first scene of this book. Alright, so, break's over. Where we left off last was that it was time to start digging for subplots. Now, I already talked a little bit about how much space in the book you need to sort of set aside for subplots. That's not a hard rule if you are writing this sort of story where the relationship between the 2 characters is super complex and super involved and that sort of thing. Then you can get away with spending less time on subplots. But I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of a subplot. And again, the Dirty Discourse people, if you're watching this, you can probably skip ahead. I'll put some commentary in the bottom of when the discussion of subplots is sort of over. You may want to hear this again now that we're going through the process, just to sort of keep all this in context. But basically, the purpose of subplots is not just to fill space, or at least it shouldn't be. In a lot of fiction, that is what subplots are used for, to pad the book. That's not necessary with this method, because we've already developed some subplots, and we already kind of know where we want the character arc to go. So the purpose of a subplot is to elucidate parts of the character transformation, right? And also to show that our characters have priorities in life, whether that's making one another a priority, or if it's a matter of prioritizing work over a relationship, or family over friends, or friends over family, or whatever the case may be. The purpose of subplots is to explore the characters a little bit, so that we can show the readers who they are when the 2 main characters, at least in a romance, are away from each other. In other genres, subplots can be used to motivate characters. I've said this before on the forum thread, that, for instance, in a thriller, the main characters, kids and family are his motivation to catch the killer, right? To make the world a safer place for them. So in a thriller, you might explore the main characters' friends and family and kids and whoever else is important in their life. You may explore that in order to set up those motivations and let the reader know that there's something at stake here, right? The main character has something to lose. But also, subplots have to be handled in a certain way in order to fit into the overall story. And a great way to handle that, a great way to use subplots to some sort of specific and intentional advantage, is to show sort of parallels, right? Subplots become learning experiences for the characters, and what they should get out of a subplot is the ability to better make a decision in the main plot. In romance, a lot of the time, that's interacting with friends and family and other problems outside of the relationship, which ultimately, by getting through them, sort of show the characters like what's important in life, right? And obviously, in a romance, the end lesson is going to be something along the lines of love is the most important thing, because that's what we're all here for in a romance. But in other genres, like I said, in a thriller, the lesson, might be how to look at things from a different angle by interacting with somebody's kids. It's the aha moment. The same kind of goes for cozy mysteries. The subplots there, a lot of the time, the best use of those is to help reframe the problem for the detective character so that they have that aha moment and realize how it is that they need to think or what they need to do in order to solve the mystery. In a fantasy setting, especially at longer lengths, there's going to be a lot of subplots, and these are the little bunny trails where we show that the main character maybe has a primary quest in front of them, but they're not entirely self-centered. They have to stop along the way and help other people overcome their problems. These become sort of like training events, basically, where the main character may have to help save a small village, and that makes them ultimately a better leader for the climax of the book where they take control of the army or something like that. If you look through the books that you love and you find those subplots, if they're done really well, you kind of have to dig them out because they seem like they're supposed to be part of the overall story, and they are if they're done well, right? A subplot that is not done well is some little bunny trail in which the character goes on some sort of a side quest which doesn't ultimately tie back into the main plot. So this is something that's really hard for a lot of people to do when they're plotting a novel, is to go ahead and plot the subplots as well. It's something that you can certainly skip this step in the plotting process, assuming you leave space for them. And as you write, you may discover like that there's food for a subplot during the process of writing out the scenes and that sort of thing. Maybe you have to introduce a best friend character, and that gets you thinking about maybe that character has some sort of crisis that's not directly related to the plot, but which the main character can kind of help them out with in order to learn something about themselves and something about how they need to handle the main plot, that sort of thing. That's a way that you can do it. It's certainly not a wrong way, but I would argue that if you do it that way, there's a good chance that you will either slow down when you hit that point, so it'll drag out the overall production process a little bit, and also it will be more difficult to do this on the fly than it will be to plan it in advance. And by difficult, I just mean it'll be difficult to really hit it the right way with the right tone and the right outcome. So that's what this process is for, dig for subplots. Now, I listed them off before in real time for me. That was about an hour ago now, basically a lunch break. So we know that we need the subplot involving Cable and his parole officer. We know that we're going to have a subplot about Cable and the gang. We know that we're going to have a subplot about Austin and his parents. And I feel like I came up with a fourth one, so I may have to review the video and see exactly where it was. I should have made these notes when I first talked about them. Let's see. Cable and his parole officer, Cable and the gang, Cable and his parents. Well, the other really important thing for Austin is going to be school. So for right now, we'll put a placeholder here and we'll say Austin and school. Because he's got classes going on. So this speaks to the fact that, okay, so we've got Austin and we've got Cable together, right? They've got their own issues. In a way, the Austin Cable internship thing is a little bit of a subplot as well, but it involves both of them specifically. So that's a thing to consider when it comes to subplots. we have a main through line here, which is about Cable and Austin's relationship together. Cable sort of opening up, Austin sort of loosening up, uh, Austin seeing Cable's lifestyle and thinking that he doesn't want to be a criminal necessarily, but he wants that freedom and that ability to just make his own choices and do his own thing. Cable, in contrast, lives a life of complete freedom, free from almost any restrictions, although we're going to obviously say that he's been in prison, so he's paid a little bit of a price for that. But at the opening of the story, that hasn't really changed his attitude very much. He's not the kind of person who goes to prison for a couple of years and it just changes him completely. He comes out and he just doesn't see any reason not to go back to his old life. He figures he just has to be more careful this time, right? Until he meets Austin and sees that someone can be really accomplished and be doing something, and Austin sort of inspires him to want to do something with his life and think about where he really wants to go and where he wants to take it. So that whole process between them, that's the real core plot of the story. It's these two characters exploring one another, exploring new ways of thinking about how they live their life, that sort of thing. It's a very character-driven plot, which, again, most romance is going to be very character-driven. Around that, outside of that sphere of the relationship, but sort of attached to the side, like if you imagine a bubble with other little bubbles sort of attached, there are other things going on. Cable has to deal with his parole officer who wants to put him back into jail. He has to deal with his gang, which is pushing him to go back to that criminal lifestyle, the criminal lifestyle that presumably got him arrested in the first place. On Austin's side, he's got his parents to deal with, their expectations of him and the pressure they put on him. He's got school, he's got classes to think about, and whether or not he's going to be able to pay for school and all these other things. Austin and Cable, that internship thing where Austin is going to be sort of a little bit responsible for Cable in some way that we have yet to really work out. That is also, in its own way, kind of a subplot. It's you might call that more of a catalyst event or a catalyst setup than a proper subplot, because it's only going to play out so far before it becomes kind of a non-issue. It won't really get resolved. It just sort of sets things up, and then when the internship is over, they stay connected to each other. So we know that we've got these things going on. We know that we've got 9 empty scenes that we need to put something in, and we know that that's about the amount of time that we need to actually devote specifically to resolving subplots. So with 4 of these, and we'll go ahead and say count this one sort of as a catalytic event, this works out pretty well. It means that the actual chapters, or the scenes that are devoted to each of these subplots, we have an average of about 2 scenes apiece. Now, that may not actually be exactly how much each subplot gets, because if we take a look at the actual outline, some of these things are already referenced. Let's go ahead and switch that up. Some of these things are already referenced. We got some of the subplots out of here, like the parole officer confronts Cable after his associates are arrested, right? That particular subplot, we've got 2 going on here, right? It's the parole officer. It's one step in that subplot, and at some point along that subplot journey. And we've got the sort of kind of almost the resolution of the gang subplot, which is fine. This takes place in the last 25% of the book in the 3rd act. So we know that that's exactly where it needs to be. We're starting to resolve things. The gang member got away, so that's a little bit more on that subplot, but that's sort of that's the fallout from that subplot and how it bleeds over into Austin's life, so that's fine. Somewhere in here, we'll end up resolving the issue with the parole officer, because we're going to get him off of Cable's back, essentially, or at least reframe their relationship so that Cable can, have his transformation and move forward with his life. In a way, that sort of resolves the catalytic event too, right? Because in the very beginning, we're going to have Austin taking some sort of legal responsibility for Cable, or acting as legal counsel, or something along those lines. So that we'll see that come to fruition here, where again, Austin, we reflect that initial catalytic event into the end of the book, so that's fine, and it's actually sets up a lot of good foreshadowing for how the book's going to end, with Austen acting as a kind of an agent of what's the word, representation, that sort of thing. Early on, we start talking about where the gang is, where they mention, let's see, probably we will introduce the gang here in the disturbance. As soon as he gets out of prison, that'll be the place that he goes. So you can see that these subplots, we have 4 particular subplots we want to talk about and deal with, and we have a lot of scenes that we're going to fill up with some subplot stuff, but they are already woven into the main heart of the story, and that's the way it should be. You don't want to come up with subplots on the fly that are disconnected from the main story that you've got. So again, that's part of the strength of this process, is that we mine subplots from what's already there instead of grafting new subplots on. Now, one of the things that we want to take into consideration, though, is the actual purpose of each of those subplots. So we're going to kind of like map those out. I'm going to fast forward through a little bit of this, and then I'll come back and talk about what it means and why I laid this course the way that I did. Okay, so it's just a very quick fleshing out of the purpose of each of these subplots. We'll take the next step where we kind of fill in the gaps in order to place them throughout the actual, throughout the outline. But now the purpose of plotting these things out and drawing them out of the material we already have and then elucidating them just a little bit here is to tell us what exactly we want to accomplish with each subplot. So you can probably just sort of read for yourself, but very quickly, Cable and his parole officer, this is how we're going to show, part of how we're going to show Cable turning around, how he's going to want to try and move forward towards a better future. We're going to use the subplot with the gang to show that he's trying to turn his back on a corrupt past. With Austen, his parents, we're going to show how he is trying to become more independent, in part because of Cable's influence. And then with school, that's going to be sort of the battleground, the place where we show that that Austen is in fact acting on that need to be more independent by taking more control of his destiny and following his passion instead of following the insistence and the expectations of the people around him. We just threw in just a little bit here about the catalytic event, about them being thrown together. We're about to work that out when we get into the specifics of plotting the scenes. But basically, this is the event that's going to sort of kind of foreshadow the future. And also, it's really important for us to be able to look back on Austen's path up to this point and say that, you know, that time, it wasn't wasted. It was good experience. It makes it clear that he's an intelligent kid who can actually make use of the lessons that he's learned in life thus far, right? This isn't the first time that Austen's actually beginning to learn any life lessons. He has skills, and we're going to show those skills early on, and then we're going to use those skills in the end to resolve the plot. We do that. It's something that I didn't put it in the plot points because it's something that I feel like you can't really plot it directly from the main plot points. It's either James Scott Bell or the other guy listed below, who talks about it's in a book called Superstructure, so it's whoever wrote that book. But it's called the Q moment, and it's where we introduce something in the beginning of the book, and that something is used to resolve the third act. It's a remarkably common device. It sounds formulaic if you are primarily a reader and not a writer, but if you are a writer, then you already know that almost all genre fiction is actually super formulaic. As a reader, you may not realize that but it's the formula that you like. The formula is what you've been trained to really enjoy about a story. If you're a reader of literary fiction, that's probably not the case, but none of this applies to literary fiction. This is all of this just applies to genre fiction. There are far fewer rules in literary fiction, other than that they have to be focused almost entirely on character, and that there's a great emphasis on poetic prose. So we have these sort of subplot bits and pieces. We now know what they're all for. What we want to do next is actually start the process of using the remaining gaps in the outline to place subplot scenes, enough that those subplots can resolve over the course of the book. So we're going to shrink these down a little bit for my ease of use. Let's see if we can get another extra card in there. Yeah, that's a bit too much. Okay, so we're going to stick with this size. Again, going to fast forward through this next little bit, and then we'll go back and talk about exactly why I put the scenes where I did and all of that. All right, so what we've done is done, again, the same sort of shorthand thing that we did with the character points. And I'll tell you why I did that. In the disturbance, so we already know that that's going to deal with the subplot where Cable goes back to his old gang. That's where we're going to introduce them and first talk about a little bit about the life that he's had before. Austin's scene, we're going to talk about his lack of freedom, so we're going to introduce his parents and his schoolwork, like the heavy load that's on him. We're going to talk about how he knows there's an internship coming up, so we're going to foreshadow that event that's in the first plot point here in the disturbance. That's really important. We'll foreshadow the same event here in Cable's disturbance, and we're going to do that so that we see that there's something that's gonna happen between these two, but the reader won't necessarily know what it is right away. They may guess, but that's fine. Like, readers guess all the time. You know how a romance is gonna play out. Like, spoilers, they get together in the end. So scene 3, that's going to be a Cable scene, and it's perfect because he's just been released, he's gone back to his thing, some time elapses, and then he has to check in with his parole officer, right? So the best way to play this scene out is probably to go ahead and say that in this particular scene, the parole officer demonstrates demonstrates his lack of faith in Cable. We're going to go ahead and set it up that the guy or woman, whoever the parole officer turns out to be, that guy, he doesn't necessarily believe that Cable can make it out in the world. He thinks that Cable, he's already hanging out with his old friends. It's just a matter of time till he trips and stops and comes back in. So we're going to do that, and that scene will lead up to something like, we haven't decided where they meet. And I think that they should meet at a party. We're going to have Austin's going to have a friend who is a little bit more outgoing than him and is trying to drag him out into the world. Please come on and do something. You know, we've got, say, a holiday, furlough day, or whatever the reason is. He's got a little bit of a gap that he could use to study or he could use to have fun, and his friend will take him to this party instead. So, Cable, lead up to the party, inciting incident scene. One of Cable's friends there we go. So he has his first check-in with his parole officer. The parole officer shows that he doesn't have a lot of faith in Cable and expects him to fail. He leaves. He's a little bit dejected when his friend says, hey, you know, there's this party going on near the campus nearby. Why don't we go there and just like booze it up and have a good time, and who knows, maybe get laid or something. We can figure out later whether or not Cable's out or not. I like the idea of him being closeted, but he doesn't seem to me like the kind of person who would necessarily be in the closet. I'm thinking of him as the sort of bad boy who is actually kind of a badass, and that when he came out, if anybody had a problem with it, he just whooped some ass, right? So he's probably out already, and he's earned the respect of his peers. That's going to be a good telling sort of character point, and we can actually have some of them sort of make light of his sexuality in the first scene and sort of demonstrate that, you know, he sort of handles his shit and doesn't have to worry about the fact that he's out of the closet amongst all these sort of gangsters. So that'll lead us right into the inciting incident, which is where they will meet at the party, and we'll go ahead and... we're going to go ahead and say that here so that we remember it when it comes time to summarize, to write this scene. Cute, charismatic, makes sense for the course of some conversation and flirting. Okay, so Austin is invited to a party during break by his friend. Some equally sort of white upper middle class Anglo name. Or, well, so I'm not a fan of tokenism. So far, this book could potentially be a little bit whitewashed. You don't always have to make a concerted effort to make your fiction really diverse. When this book is actually written, I won't make much of a reference to anyone's race so that the reader kind of just fills in those particular gaps themselves. It's going to be pretty much assumed that a kid named Austin is probably a upper middle class white kid with rich white parents and stuff like that, because that's sort of something that's just in the zeitgeist. But one thing that, and this has nothing to do with the outlining, it's just a sort of philosophical point, is that you want to be careful to, you know, avoid entirely whitewashing a book. That is to say, make every single character in the book white, but you also want to avoid tokenism, which is where you throw in a non-white character just for the purpose of checking a box. I mentioned before about the whole interracial romance angle. Those are choices that every author gets to make for themselves. It's just worthwhile to note that in order to, if you're going to do that, and if you're doing it with the purpose of trying to be sort of racially and culturally sensitive, keep in mind that tokenism is not necessarily the way to go about that. The way to go about that is to put less of an emphasis on race altogether, and sort of allow the reader to sort of fill in the gaps for themselves, instead of forcing them into a particular mold. So instead of forcing them to imagine all white characters, or forcing them to imagine one character in specific as non-white, things like that. A little bit of a bunny trail, but it's worthwhile to consider at this stage. By his friend, we'll say Matt. Matt could be anybody. And now we have an extra supporting character, which we will talk about later in here. Actually, it's worthwhile to go ahead and talk about Matt. Austin's closest thing to a friend. They're roommates. They live in the same dorm room together. That's about as close as it gets to Austin for having real friends, because he is entirely devoted to his work, to his school, and that sort of thing. We will sort of lay out and name some of the other supporting characters, the gang members. We'll pick one or two gang members in particular who are specifically close to Cable. That way we have some context and some characters to whose eyes we can sort of experience there. So Cable's subplot gang, that's the next one. So let's follow the course that we've got so far. We've got our inciting incident. They meet at a party. Cable learns a little about his life and realizes he's a highly driven individual. We're going to start hinting here at the idea that he wants to do more. We should allude to his interest in architecture, because we know that that's going to come up later. First plot point. So we know that Cable decides, like, maybe it's not a good idea to get involved with somebody like Austin. They're from different worlds, whatever the reason is. But then in the first plot point, we learn that, oh, you two are going to be working together for a little while. So they have forced proximity, basically. So that's great for a first plot point. We want to make sure... we want to make sure that in the course of this, we allude to the ending. Austin's legal aptitude, because he's going to use that tool from his past to help resolve the third act. So Cable, subplot gang. We want to use this to some effect. Cable's first moment of so his first, we're going to start showing his dissatisfaction a little bit, and that's in line with where his character arc is, right? Character arc point 2. He's everywhere between here and his third character arc. That's what we're sort of focused on for his story. So that's part of how when you're trying to figure out, okay, so we've spread these subplots around, subplot gang, subplot parents, and so on. What does that actually mean? Well, the tone of that part of the subplot, you want to drive that with the part of the character arc that they're in. He's in there. This is the point 2. It's the longing. It's when they realize what they don't have and they start to think about it. That longing is going to create dissatisfaction with where they currently are. It's going to highlight it for them. So as we move through their arc, he's going to get there, be hanging out with the gang, whatever it is that happens in this scene. It's going to be, the purpose of it is going to be to sort of characterize his feeling of dissatisfaction, looking back and thinking that maybe the gang life isn't for him. I say focus on having been in prison for 2 years because that's what he's going to initially sort of use to justify that thinking, right? He doesn't know exactly what's wrong or what he doesn't like about it, so he starts searching for some meaning. Austin, his subplot, his parents, again, he's in the same place, that dissatisfaction. So let's say... No, let's say that they come to town. Let's actually introduce them. Right, okay, so we're going to start setting up the conflict between what Austin's parents want for him and what he wants for himself. So they're going to visit, and over the course of their visit, that he'll talk about, you know, his internship. He met this guy Cable. He's actually more interesting than he initially thought he was. He's got so much potential. It's Austin trying to meet the expectations of his parents, but at the same time try and find some sort of satisfaction in that. Right, so he's struggling with the fact that he's dissatisfied with the course of his life right now. And again, just like Cable is sort of reaching for some sort of justification, Austin is going to do the same thing. He's going to reach for some sort of justification about, you know, how he can pull meaning and satisfaction out of the course he's already in. So just a side note here about that process and about the character arc overall. It's something to think about. Not every character in every book is going to have the same arc, but there are some basic processes to self-realization, right? You have to recognize, you have to be lacking something, and we all are on some level. Something has to trigger a realization that you have that lack, and then that dissatisfaction has to reach a point where you want to do something about it. That way, when you encounter the opportunity to have that realization or to make whatever change it is you feel like you need to make, even if you don't know exactly what that change is, if you're not dissatisfied because you've realized that you are missing something, then when that opportunity comes, you'll take the easy path. You'll take it's not that we're lazy. It's that we have to be prompted by dissatisfaction in order to want to change. So that's what we're doing here, is we're setting up that dissatisfaction. We're setting up the sort of, you could say, the bargaining stage of the grief of losing that old life. You could say it a lot of different ways. The main thing is that we need to demonstrate to the reader there are reasons that they're dissatisfied and that the world that they currently exist in wants to hold on to them. So Cable, of course, we know this is a montage and that it's leading up to scene 10. Scene 10 is where we have our next character arc plot point for Austin, which leads right into the next character arc plot point for Cable in the pinch point. We've got two scenes showing how they sort of meet each other, and then we end up with what we planned for Austin, his subplot, school/parents, right? So this is where we're going to start taking these two subplots, and you'll notice that these are the only two scenes where they're mixed up like this, right? School/parents, officer/gang. This is part of a process of intentionally starting to weave these subplots together. I recommend that when you get to the point where you're plotting the subplot stuff, that at least somewhere, I would recommend around the middle, unless you resolve a subplot particularly early in the story, which I don't think that you should. What we will have here is the place where we see all three of these plots sort of work together in some way to give us a better sense of what exactly is happening there. So I'm going to fast forward through a little bit of this, since you know generally like how I'm approaching this and why, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit about the choices that I made and the reasons and what we're going to do with scene 25. All right. So we filled out basically all of our plot point scenes, and it's okay to note right here that so whenever we did our main scenes, we had our character arc scenes, and we had our main plot points, midpoint, pinch point, third plot point. When we did those, we had a specific goal in mind, which is to summarize it as quickly as possible and to focus again on a revelation and a choice. Now, each of these subplot points, they also incorporate that to some degree. There's a little bit of extra note there, and it won't be the first time or the last time, or I mean, it won't be the last time that we incorporate some additional sort of thematic notes into our scenes. But it's the first time that we really start to see some of that stuff crop up, and we do it there because one of the other purposes of a good subplot is to kind of sort of keep the theme of the story on track. So looking through this, you can now see that almost all of these plot points are filled in. All of these scenes. We've got subplots, we've got scenes that are specifically to sort of generate character arc, we've got lots of opportunities for romantic moments between our two leads, we've got our major plot points, so we know that the book is going to be well-paced as far as its overall pacing. So what we have left is one empty scene. So what we do is we just sort of think about what can we do with it, and do we need to do anything with it. So we look at the previous few scenes. Scene 22, this is right after Cable runs off. Austin gets arrested and then bailed out of jail by his parents, so we're showing that sort of a little bit of a slide, even though he's not serious about going back into law. We've got Cable learns about his gang's plan, and they want him to go and refuse, and he fights. And remember that in here, there may well end up being these three individual sort of shorter scenes folded into one scene. And it wouldn't actually be a bad idea in that process to actually take some time out and put an extra scene in there to talk about how Austin is actually feeling about this whole process. We could do that in the next scene, in scene 24, or we can do it in the midst of this. That's perfectly fine as long as we sort of maintain our kind of like back and forth perspective shifting that we've been doing, where the odd scenes for Cable, even scenes for Austin. Either way, we get up to the third plot point, and this is the point at which they let everything out. They probably have sex again, whether or not it's at Austin's parents' house. or whether it's somewhere else. Something something. Austin's parents find out that he's still an anthropology major and let him know that they'll no longer pay for anything. So one good thing that we might do with this is to sort of show the fallout from that third plot point, right? It's not bad because we're actually, so the reason that we might do that and do it from Cable's point of view is you can see that coming up we've got the black moment, we've got the climax, we've got the stuff sort of a bunch of things happening here that are really bad. This is completely just a narrative device to basically take that third plot point, everything's really happy, take scene 25, make it even better. They have a great couple of days together. We might montage and talk about how they're just exploring each other for several days or something like that. Austin has just basically dropped his classes, right? So he's got a lot of free time. Probably he holds a job of some sort, although his parents are still supporting him until scene 26. So what we can do here is use this empty scene as an opportunity to basically think about it in terms of if you're constructing a roller coaster for the reader emotionally. This is a great point, and we happen to have a scene empty for it, where we can take the reader up to a really good high emotional peak where everything is really happy and things are finally coming together, and then we're going to quickly pull all of Austin's funding. Cable gets arrested. Austin gets lied to from this gang member, and everything goes down and plummets really, really hard into that black moment. That's great, and here it just sort of worked out the way it needed to. If you are going to write a romance novel and you get to this point and you look at the third plot point and you're building towards the black moment, you could, based on this process, having sort of learned how it all lays out, go ahead and set aside the scene after the third plot point to actually do that intentionally, to set aside that scene as the happy scene, right? Throughout the course of this book, and we're gonna get into using the actual scene points here to plot these each of these scenes out in a way that we can actually write to. What we'll learn is that the end of every scene basically ends in some kind of a disaster. It ends with consequences that make things overall more difficult, more complicated, more tense, something like that. So this is a great place to actually take a break for that and let this scene just end on a happy note and just give the reader a little bit of a rest, a little bit of happiness and joy, and then of course drop them like a concrete block to the black moment so that they can shatter on the rock bottom floor that is the black moment, and then we can slowly piece them together with the last several scenes. So this one, we might actually split this scene. Let's Cable, Austin, we can go back and forth. We may break this up into a couple of little scenes. And all we're going to say here is Cable and Austin are happy together. Any number of things could happen in there. We can characterize a little, show who they are when they sort of finally open up to one another, which is what they did in the third plot point. Maybe in this particular scene, we'll have Austin open up a little bit as well, kind of the way that Cable did to him. We can show it's going to be Cable's point of view probably primarily, unless we do split it, which is not a done deal. And we can take that chance to show Cable's reaction to learning all about Austin, and it can be super tender and super sweet and all this other stuff. It'll be a great scene. So that's all of our scenes. That's 31 scenes. Take note of the time, 2:25. Take out the amount of time that I paused to discuss things, and we've got our rough draft of an outline with just the individual scene summaries, and we've got that within a few hours. It's super balanced. We've got good parallelism between both of the characters. We've developed an underlying plot very slowly. We've got some subplots going on. We know the different movements that these characters are going to make around each other. We know how they're reacting to their own circumstances and to the circumstances that are pressing into their life and pressuring them from different angles. We've got our plot points laid out in places where they're going to do the most good for the story. In other words, they're going to keep the story well paced. We've got reflections from the beginning, from the first act of the book into the third act of the book. All together, this book has all of the necessary qualities and earmarks of a well-paced, story-driven, character-driven book. So that's a great place to be at this point. This is the point at which you really want to know that you've got all the structural elements there and that they're good and solid. And we've got some notes in various scenes telling us exactly how we want to use different scenes. We're going to add more notes as we go. That'll be part of the scene plotting process, where we just throw in a little bit about to remind ourselves, like, the tone of this particular scene is going to be this or that. So step 7, step 8 is to repeat step 5 for your subplots, focusing on revelations and choices. We actually just did that. We went through, I sort of skipped that, but what it's meant to say here is that we're going to earmark those subplot scenes. That's where I went through and said subplot parole officer, subplot gang. I technically jumped ahead to step 8 there and did that, but it's the same thing. You're going to do what you, for your subplot points, you're going to do the same thing that you did for your main plot points. Go back and start filling them out with just super simple, super direct scene direction. Step 9, rearrange the order of any scenes which are not major plot points and need to get the order to feel right. If we look through here, we've pretty much already got a really good order. I'm not too concerned about where things are. A couple of point of view scenes, I want to keep them alternating, right? So I think that they alternate well. The main thing that you might look for, you can break the alternating pattern once or twice, you know, that sort of thing. It's not that big a deal. But you might look through through the plot points at this point in your own work, and basically just look at what's each scene's goal, whose point of view is it, is that the best point of view, can you justify or use the point of view that's already there in a way to make the scene more effective. Any change that you make at this point, you have to make it for one specific reason, which is to make the scene or make the story more effective. Don't do anything just because you're sticking to a convention like having alternating points of view. In this particular case, for this story, it works out really well that way, so that the alternating point of view, their points of view fall on scenes that make sense where they are, and that they lead from one scene into the next really well. But if you get in there and you're looking at the order of things and you think, you know, what I really should do is have this, scene 10, Austin's next character arc point, it would make more sense to do this and then do the montage. Absolutely, just switch these things around and rename the scenes, and rename this scene 9 and this scene 10 if it's going to serve the story best. Now, in my opinion, just because of that particular plot point or that particular point in the story, I think it makes sense to go ahead and do the montage first and then, you know, talk about the consequences of that montage afterwards. So I'm going to leave that like it is. That, though, this is the time, now that you've got all the summaries out, that's the time to start reordering scenes if that's what you need to do. A point here is that rearrange the scenes which are not major plot points. When you go through and you start moving things around, do not move any of the major plot points. Those things, they are the linchpins, they are the nails that are going to keep the story on track from point A to point B. So you want to leave those where they are, because that's a matter of pacing. Step 10, revise your chapter sentences from start to finish just in case. Revision here will save you time later. Yes, it will. If I hadn't been going through and explaining all of this stuff as I went, I would have done this much, much faster. I would have stumbled and probably made a few mistakes. There would be places where I definitely needed to revise. I could probably stand to revise this just a little bit now, but because I'm actually going through the process and talking about it as I go, I am going to end up sort of revising on the fly as we go, because I'm deep, deep, deep into the story, because I'm having to be very, very conscious of every choice that I make since I'm explaining it as I go. So that I'm also going to skip for myself. But after you move scenes around and you figure out exactly where. Let's say you switch scenes 7 and 8, right? You may need to go back and revise exactly how those play out. So that's the point at which you'll have to look at revisions in the initial rough outline. Step 11. This is where the magic happens. Plot each scene with 5 plot points in single sentences. Now, if you are coming here from Dirty Discourse, you already know all about this. This is the thing that I have harped on since the very beginning of that particular thread. However, there are a lot of people here who are YouTubers, so Dirty Discourse folks, unless you want to go over this again, take a look at the timestamp that should be right around here somewhere if I manage to do the video editing correctly. And skip ahead if you want to. For those of you who are YouTubers just coming here, you're just curious, you want to be a writer, whatever the deal is, here's a really quick overview of these 5 points. The purpose of these 5 points in each scene, and it'll look a little bit like over here in the notes section, we've got scene points. Each one of these is going to correlate to one of these 5 points. We have our incident, our complication, the revelation, the change, or you could call it a choice. It's not always a choice, sometimes it's just a change, and then the outcome, what happens at the end of the scene as a result of everything that's happened before it. These 5 points will probably happen naturally. If I were to take this scene right here and just write a scene just based on this summary, there is a really good chance that I would naturally have an incident, a complication, the reader would learn something over the course of the scene about this character, about the world, the relationship, whatever, that based on that revelation, the character will make some sort of have some sort of a reaction. They'll change something about the course of their direction in the scene, and then at the end of the scene there will be an outcome, which some people call a hook. It can be a hook, but I like to think of it, it helps for me to think about it in terms of what is the net gain or loss because of the events of the scene, and that is the outcome. The outcome has a couple of different versions, right? And I'm going to leave this here so that if you want, you can pause it and you can read over this, but traditionally, one particular author has elucidated the possible endings as confirmation or denial, and they say that basically you answer at the end of the scene. The character wanted something to begin with, and you answer at the end with either no, no, and furthermore, yes, or yes, but, which implies that they get what they want, but at a cost. I expanded and elucidated that with just a little bit. I think there are a good, 6 or so ways to really play that out. Either there's an immediate complication. This is the sort of thing where a character makes a choice and then instantly there's a reprisal of some sort, a complication that happens specifically because they made that change or choice. The second version is where the plot thickens. This is where, based on the character's encounter with whatever the new information is in the revelation, they end up making some sort of a change or a choice, and as a result of that, they learn something, or the reader learns something about the plot that makes it more complicated. This is used a lot in cozy mysteries. At the end of an investigation scene, the detective character learns something new about the problem, learns that there's a new suspect or that there's an overlooked clue or something like that. That's the plot thickens. That's the outcome for that sort of story. The third version is where the outcome appears positive initially, but we learn in a sequel scene, that's a scene that takes that outcome and uses it as sort of part of the basis for the next oncoming scene. We have several of those throughout the course of this book. They're going to seem positive, but then we learn that there were actually consequences. In general, if something good happens to your character at the end of a scene in a book where you're trying to generate tension or emotional depth, emotional costs, things like that, you want drama, Nothing good happens to your characters without them paying a price for it, without it somehow making things ultimately worse. The outcome in number 4 is genuinely catastrophic. Basically, this is something that can kind of come out of nowhere sometimes, that you don't want to drop it on a reader out of nowhere entirely. If you're going to use this, you have to foreshadow it before that something bad is coming. And then this is where we end the scene with a group of assassins bursting through the door that we, as readers, learned that those people were on their way several scenes before. So it's a catastrophic outcome. The outcome is not only catastrophic, but we quickly learn that it's actually much worse than we imagined in a sequel scene. We compound that catastrophe in this version, where it is a catastrophe, but we have alluded to the reader already that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is actually something even worse coming, and it gives the reader a sense of, first of all, holy crap, what are they going to do because of this outcome? How are they going to handle this? And also makes them suddenly tense because they know that the characters don't know the whole story. The reader knows more about the story than the characters do, and they know that that group of assassins is actually led by some sort of supervillain, and he's actually just a little way behind them. So they start wondering, like, when is he going to show up? When is the other shoe going to drop? So it's a great narrative choice to make. If you do catastrophes and the follow-up catastrophes, if you do those too often, it becomes exhausting. You can't end every scene that way. And then, of course, the final one is that rarely the outcome is actually positive, but this happens almost exclusively after the midpoint and then not often. Really, it should be restricted almost entirely to the third act. That's really the best place for anything like that. And remember what we said about the scene right after the third plot point? Cable and Austin are happy together. This is going to end with a genuinely positive outcome. They have a great time together. They're finally sort of getting to be free of their various pasts and their complications, and they have a moment of rest where it can just be good for a second. Note that shortly after that, shit hits the fan again. You don't want to give too many rests because then the story is boring and it's just about people being happy, and no one wants to read a story about people being happy because we're miserable creatures, and we want to know that everyone else is also miserable, even in our fiction. It's the miserable aspect of it. That's where we draw the enjoyment from. Seeing other people handle their misery, it's a vicarious experience. So you rarely, maybe once or twice in any given book, do you want to use this happy outcome to a scene. So all that said, we're going to start doing that in just a second. I'm going to take another short break so I can grab something to slake my thirst, because my throat is very, very dry. And then I'll be back, and then we'll start doing this process.